Welcome to Brussels Forum 2020. We are pleased to introduce the Vice President for Foreign Policy at the German Marshall Fund, Dr. Ian Lesser.
Good morning. Good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. Welcome back to this 15th edition of Brussels Forum, brought to you this year in a virtual format. And we're really delighted to be able to do it this way this year, even under these conditions. It's been a terrific set of conversations so far, and we look forward to more of them. At the outset, let me just thank our partners. A very sincere thanks to our founding partners, Daimler and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and to our forum partner, Deloitte, and to all our supporting and our associate and our knowledge partners. We're really very grateful for your support. We wouldn't be able to do this without you. Yesterday, we had a fantastic conversation with the German defense minister. I hope you were able to see that, and you can still watch it, of course. And today we get to continue our set of conversations on global security with another fantastic panel, another great group of people, and I'll let our moderator introduce them in a moment. But to extend our conversation to think more broadly about the implications of the pandemic, but also the economic crisis for global security writ large, on both sides of the Atlantic, but also globally, of course. And so we're really delighted to have with us Shashank Joshi, who is the defense editor of The Economist, to moderate this conversation today. And Shashank, let me turn this over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Ian, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us. The title of our session today is Defending the New Normal, Security After the Coronavirus. The most important backdrop of our discussion is obviously the pandemic. I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that 7 of the 10 worst affected countries by recorded deaths, which is a contentious measure, but nonetheless, are NATO members. And the 5 top spenders of NATO are in that list, which gives us an indication of the impact this pandemic has had on the Euro-Atlantic security community. But there are also other events that are likely to ripple through our discussion today. Events in America over the past 2 weeks, I think, have raised some substantial, in some cases, some very profound questions over the nature of American stability, predictability, leadership, including leadership in Europe. And if reports are to be believed, we may also be looking at the withdrawal of as many as 1 in 3 American troops in Germany, something that would also have very substantial effects on the perception of US leadership in Europe. Meanwhile, the erosion of arms control in the Euro-Atlantic context has continued apace, the most recent casualty being the Open Skies Treaty. To discuss all of that, I am delighted to welcome a panel of many talents. I'll introduce them all as they speak. They'll all have 3 minutes to make opening remarks. We'll have a brief discussion, and then I'll turn it over to you. So please begin formulating your questions so we can have a vigorous discussion for the next hour or so. I think we should begin with Congressman Seth Moulton. Congressman Moulton is a Democratic representative from Massachusetts. He is a former officer of the US Marine Corps. He's a member of the House Armed Services Committee. And I think he's the ideal person to reflect for us on what the events in the US, what this protest unprecedented for 50 years means for US standing in the world, particularly for US standing in Europe, and whether the impact will be short-lived or more substantial. Congressman Moulton, please.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with all of you, although it would be more fun to be there in person. I'm grateful for this opportunity to share some views and learn what you're thinking about these incredibly important questions for us as an alliance. You've heard a lot already through the Brussels Forum from some of my American colleagues about some of the things that we know. American credibility has eroded with our current administration. We need to modernize Cold War alliance structures like NATO to meet the security challenges of the 21st century. That we need to take this moment to strengthen alliances and partnerships. And we've talked about the fact that civil unrest in America has implications for the transatlantic relationship because it is further calling into question our own credibility on these core values issues that we always try to lead on. Instead of spending too much time just making those same points right now, I'd like to just dwell on a couple of extensions of those points that I think are important for us to continue. The first is that the world has changed too much. We simply can't go back to the world as we once had it. Shortly after Trump was inaugurated, I gave a speech about how we have to reinvigorate our alliances, remind our enemies that we're still here, and essentially go back to restoring the world order that Trump was trying to take apart. That's no longer sufficient. We have to modernize NATO. We can't go back to the way it was. While we have to deter Russia, the real significant threat that will face all of us in the coming years is China. And we also need to shift towards modern technology more quickly, even more quickly than before the coronavirus pandemic, because we simply won't be able to afford to have the same military that we've had in the past. The second thing I'd like to say is that the coming conflict will be not just a war of defense capabilities and deterrence, but a war of values. And whoever makes the hard choices and smart investments now will be in a position to set those values for the rest of the world. Much like the Cold War, the New World Order is aligning on the side of what is more effective. And COVID-19 has demonstrated both those strengths and weaknesses on either side of this equation. And when I say that equation, I'm mainly talking about the United States and our allies on one side, and China and its authoritarian approach on the other. But unlike the Cold War, where we could force these economic relationships, where we could have an economic system in the West that was totally divorced from the Soviet Union, we're in a place now that China is very competitive with us. They have some technology that frankly exceeds our own, and our economies are deeply intertwined. That makes this challenge more difficult, and it makes it all the more important that we stand up not just with the strongest defense, but with the strongest values. And that's why what's going on at home right now for our country, this real moment of reckoning, is so important, not just domestically, but internationally as well. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Congressman, thank you. You came in under time, which is a real accolade for any panelist. Thank you very much. I think we'll turn now to Minister Artis Pabriks. He is Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defence of Latvia. Thank you very much for joining us, Minister. You're the only government official, let alone Minister of Defence here. And I wonder if you could give us all a sense of how the threat picture looks from your desk, how that threat picture has changed over the course of the pandemic, including whether you see changes in Russian behavior, whether Russian behavior has been opportunistic or passive or distracted, and whether the way you do your business has had to change over the course of this crisis. Minister, please.
Thank you very much. I will try to be brief and concise. First of all, I have to tell that I have really pleasure to talk to you from so-called Baltic bubble, because appears that we have been up to now, and I have to stress up to now, quite successful with fighting this pandemic, COVID-19. And at this moment, we already have a free movement among all three Baltic states, and we hope to expand our bubble to other countries in Europe, but not to lose vigilance. Now, what changed and what might change because of this crisis? First of all, we must all understand that by pandemic, a rise of pandemic, other threats did not disappear, just like other diseases did not disappear in this time. But we learned a number of lessons through our preparedness and trying to be prepared to cover or to fight this pandemic. First of all, we understood, and I think many countries noticed that our global order and global economy and open economy has their dark sides, logistics. So logistics, mobility, that was suddenly something where we were simply left alone as a nation countries, because everybody were looking for the same resources, and most of those resources were produced in China. So the bad thing, that means we have to think about our own fundamental provisions of resources and logistics. And this is what we do in Latvia now, because we already have a decision of Cabinet of Ministers of Government to make a list of necessary goods for the 3 months period. And we probably will try to ensure that we could guarantee for future also access to these goods for our societies for the nearest months. Secondly, as you can see, many things have been happening, especially in such countries as Latvia, which is I would say, quite good with IT technologies, suddenly virtually. And that means that also cyber attacks increased, because there is much more possibility to gain information exactly through cyber attacks, because most of the things that we were doing not through such screens now is happening through screens. So cybersecurity is one of the issues which is highly relevant. Thirdly, where it comes also Russia and partly China in our view, it is strategic communication. Of course, such type of crisis is always used by our opponents, and Russia was not sleeping as well. Again, trying to use this our opening and telling that the West is not ready to fight such crisis, and look how they are not able to deal with their health problems, and they were even trying to give ideas that they send assistance to Italy and some other countries, even if this assistance to Italy or Serbia was not of big necessity, but they use this simply for propaganda reasons. Fourthly, your question about where do other diseases or where do Russia stand at this moment? You know, for quite a long time, we were thinking that when Russians become weaker, they might get, let's say, less obsessed with any kind of revisionist thinking. I think at this moment, I cannot reassure anymore this is true, because we can see that this pandemic actually was used also by Russians to increase their preparedness, also conventional military preparedness next to our borders. Also their announcement about, of course, this is nothing new, but about their possibility to use nuclear force first. Their presence at our western borders, or let's say their western borders, our eastern borders, it is really giving us this feeling of threat being a border country. By telling all this, of course, we are very much concerned about further devaluation of international organizations. I'm not speaking about World Trade Organization or something like this, but also about the Open Sky Treaty. And even if I very much understand why Americans left it, because Russians were breaking the spirit of this law. They were breaking the spirit of Open Skies law also on the Latvian territory. And not only, we still think that we, in the longer or in a shorter term, must find something in a place of this and other treaties. And of course, we are very much concerned also by the idea, which was not confirmed by Pentagon and other officials, and I hope that Congress would have something to say regarding the possible, I would say, withdrawal of American troops from Germany, because we don't want that Europe is becoming weaker. We need American presence in Europe, and by withdrawing troops, possible withdrawal of troops from Germany means also weakening security in the Baltic states. So I will now stop with this. If there is any questions, how we were fighting COVID-19 successfully or anything else, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think that point about the parallel or the coexistence of traditional threats with pandemic challenges is a very good point to bring in Rose Gottemoeller. Rose Gottemoeller is a former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. She's also a former senior arms control official before that, and a very experienced voice on these issues. Ms. Gottemoeller, we're at a point where Secretary General Stoltenberg has sort of inaugurated his reflection process for the next 10 years of the alliance. In a way, NATO has spent the last 5 years getting itself in the space of an Article 5 world, of peer conflict, state-on-state conflict, after many years of thinking about counterinsurgency and out-of-area operations. And now it's faced with an extremely non-traditional security challenge. What advice would you be giving Mr. Stoltenberg as to how his reflection process needs to change in response to the pandemic?
Thank you very much, Shashank, and good morning to everyone from California. It's good to be with you. First of all, I did want to quote Jens Stoltenberg to begin with, my old boss, because he has just launched the reflection process, and what he had to say is the underpinning for what I want to say. He said on Monday in addressing the German Marshall Fund at the Atlantic Council that NATO must stay strong militarily, be more united politically, and take a broader approach globally. Setting, he said, NATO is the only place that brings Europe and North America together every day. We have the structures and the institutions in place. What we need is the political will to use NATO. Now, my point is the large one, that is, in this pandemic, NATO has shown the institutional agility and creativity to play a leadership role as we consider how to refurbish and perhaps even rebuild the international system in the aftermath of this crisis, which is shaking the very foundations of the post-World War II system. Already that system was under attack, was under threat from a number of sources. But I think this pandemic, with its effect on our economies, with its effect on international cooperation, has shown that we really need to think hard about the future of our international institutions. And I would argue that NATO is in a good place to help do that rethink. The reason I say that is that it has shown an incredible amount of agility and creativity, I think. Throughout the pandemic, it was our disaster relief function, the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center, which in my thinking has always been the kind of Cinderella of NATO organizations, not getting a lot of funding, not getting a lot of attention, but punching far above its weight in terms of its ability to deliver training on disaster relief. And indeed, they stepped forward during this pandemic to deliver assistance across the alliance and to partner countries as well. So I think NATO in this way has shown that it can respond outside of its normal mission area to really help to deal with a disaster, to deal with a difficult situation. And that kind of experience, I think we can build on now. NATO already has ongoing cooperation, of course, with the European Union, very good and strengthening cooperation, also with the United Nations and with the African Union. We need to think about ways to work together further with these organizations to strengthen international institutions and think about the road forward. But I do want to underscore in finishing my remarks that, of course, we cannot abandon the core missions of NATO. They will remain, and I think you're quite right, Shashank, there has been a lot of attention to deterrence and defense against the possible aggression of Russia over the last years since the invasion of Crimea in 2014. That attention must continue, as well as attention to the counterterrorism mission also, because the threat of violent extremism is not going to leave us as we also struggle to recover from this pandemic. So with that, I'll turn the floor back to you. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much for that. And I think that list of tasks and the fact that they're just getting longer and longer rather than sort of tighter and tighter here is an incredible challenge to states, particularly states in Europe, whose populations may ask whether traditional definitions of national security and defense are still justifiable and valid in a world where thousands, tens of thousands have died of a disease, and yet where spending on defense is still extremely substantial. So that, I think, is a very good time to bring in Sir Michael Arthur. Sir Michael is president of Boeing International. He's also a distinguished former British diplomat, ambassador to India and Germany. So Michael, are we going to see a collapse in defence spending, or at least a backsliding in all of the efforts that we have seen over the last few years? And what does that mean for armed forces, and what does it mean for those like yourself in defence industry in terms of how you respond to that? Michael, I think you're muted, sorry.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
You were fine, but I think you've muted yourself again.
Is that better now?
Brilliant.
Great, so I'm so sorry. Well, thank you for your very apposite question, but let me just put that in a slightly wider context of this crisis. I mean, this crisis has been probably the most single global challenge that we face as a globe. And that, in a sense, as the Secretary General was saying, has accelerated some of the changes and things happening in the world, the economy and politics anyway. But if you look at the reaction, it's been a very nation state based reaction. And so from a global company's point of view, and I didn't just speak for us, I speak for the world has increasingly got companies that work across the world, this reversion to a nationalist response risks undermining some of the global interaction and growth that we've seen. You ask about defense spending. Well, of course, with all the other pressures on governments now, I mean, despite the amount that they're throwing at the economies to re-stimulate growth, there's going to be pressures, as always, on defense. And so we need that global economy to be getting back into high gear as fast as possible. I mean, we hope in aerospace that aviation will be one of the leaders of that, because business to business contacts, tourism and so on, all needs to get going. But governments need that finance from a growing economy. And for that, it's really important that we keep borders open and we keep an open trading system. That seems to be one of the risks that's coming out of this reversion to sort of nationalist perceptions in how they operate. I mean, look at how global companies, they're sort of a bond between countries that are in a security sense challenging each other, because we all work in many different countries, some of whose politicians don't always respect each other. And we have to do that. But global supply chains are dependent on those links. We work, for example, in China, we work in Russia, we work in the United States, work across Europe. All of those countries have their own complex political relationships, but a global company has to work with and through all of that. So back to where we should go in NATO, I mean, as Rose said, I think NATO has shown itself in this crisis to be doing some quite remarkable things that were beyond what you would have expected in a defense community. I mean, C-17s flying protective equipment around, Romanian medics working in Alabama. I mean, this is a new departure for NATO. And it shows, I think, the interrelationship of traditional defense, the new security threats, the economic links I'm talking about, and in particular also beyond that, trade. And that won't go away. Those linkages will remain there going forward. So we, the businesses, particularly the defense businesses, have to work together, I think, because partnership is half the answer to this. And the transatlantic defense partnership has to be a very cooperative one on the business side, as well as on the defense government side as well. A final point for me, you mentioned China. I think this crisis has accelerated the emergence of the competition with China across the world as a mixture of competition and cooperation. That cooperation can be very healthy, and the competition, we'll see how that plays out. But it extends also into the economic field. You look at Britain at the moment wrestling with the issue how far it should take 5G investments here. Germany is having a similar debate. So I think the world has changed with this crisis. And as the Secretary General said, accelerated change. And the economic dimension to this plays absolutely into NATO's security responsibility. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. That's an extremely good overview. And I think I just want to take up that point on China a little bit more and ask whether the pandemic itself has pushed Europeans closer to America's view of the security challenges posed by China. This is obviously a subject of discussion that came up in the Brussels Forum yesterday in a dedicated session on China. And I just want to take it a little bit further on the security context. And I wonder if Minister Pabriks, if I could just address this to you, you addressed what you politely called strategic communications, and we can infer what you mean by that in this context. But has the pandemic changed the way that you think about China within your defense portfolio and the ways that it comes up on the agenda in relation to transatlantic security? Could you say a little bit more on that for us, please?
Well, of course, we are a relatively small country, and our first concern always have been Russia, because of our asymmetric geopolitical challenge, because Russia in the late years was always posing for us an existential threat. But we also see how China is rising and how situation is changing in the world regarding the global competition. Also the recent events in Hong Kong, attitudes towards Taiwan, South China Sea, you just name it. So from our perspective, it is highly important that China and Russia doesn't continue with the same goal to split the West, because we can see that the patterns, what Russians are using and what Chinese are using by different means, are actually very similar, because both countries are willing to see weakened West. Either it is with financial investments in Europe, trying to split country against country, or trying to split America and Canada away from Europe. So in short, China, of course, is a growing challenge to the Western order, Western influence, and for us, being a country of smaller size and at the border of NATO and European Union, this, of course, also poses a strategic threat and existential threat. So we are concerned.
Thank you. Rose Gottemoeller, could I also draw you on that question, please? Do you think that this is, do you see a sort of more enduring shift in the way that European perceptions of China have changed over the course of this crisis?
Well, Shashank, I like to remind everybody that the pivot to Asia actually started under President Obama, and the United States has long been focused on China and on the Pacific basin as an area where more, in the view of Washington, more military force and military attention is going to have to be paid. And so I would say that this trend has been underway for almost 10 years now, 8 years as far as I know. It was interrupted in 2014, again, by the Russian invasion of Crimea and the increased destabilization on the borders of NATO. And the minister has pointed quite rightly to the fact that Russia continues to be a threatening neighbor. And so we have to continue, of course, to focus on that. But I think in recent times, what the pandemic has done is heighten again awareness of the emerging role of China as a global actor, both for good and for ill. I do note that back in December, the NATO leaders said that they will look for both challenges that have to be dealt with in working with China, but also opportunities for working with China. I see now that with the effects of the pandemic, with concerns about Chinese defense modernization, including nuclear modernization, that there is a renewed focus on the challenges that are emanating from China. But I do want to underscore once again that the recognition was there almost a decade ago, and that in some ways the NATO allies were lucky that Washington refocused in such an intense way on NATO and the Euro-Atlantic relationship because of Crimea and what happened there. So I think what we need to look for going forward now is a balance between continuing to pay attention to the real difficulties and challenges of addressing Russia, and thinking about how to both work with China going forward, but also be aware and be ready to respond to any challenges that China might pose on the security front.
Congressman Moulton, can I bring you in on something that in some ways fuses those two challenges, the Euro-Atlantic security context and the Chinese challenge, and that's the subject of arms control, both in terms of the collapse of the INF Treaty and in terms of the potential trouble looming on the horizon with the possible expiration of New START next year, which would result in the absence of any caps on the US and Russian arsenals for the first time in decades. They're both connected to US perceptions of China and China's arsenals. So I'd like to get your sense of the degree to which a succeeding democratic administration, or really any pragmatic administration on arms control, can go back to the world we had on arms control, can restore something looking like the INF, something that looks like the INF Treaty, can sign back up to open skies, can renew New START without any problems, without any further follow-on talks. How realistic is that? And if not, what actually does follow in the realm of arms control from your perspective?
Well, I think in many ways we more or less could go back to that. I think it would be a mistake, though. I think we live in a new world with new strategic challenges. It's important to acknowledge that sitting right here in America today, the greatest strategic threat that we face is from Russia's strategic arsenal. You can't argue with that. But there's no question that every defense expert I know looks at the next 50 years, they're far more concerned about China and how rapidly they are modernizing than we are about Russia. Both are enemies that we need to be concerned about. But to naively think that China is just a benevolent actor that sometimes we disagree with and otherwise we can work with, I think would be a huge mistake. So we have to modernize our arms control, and we have to find ways to bring China into those agreements, while also acknowledging that we would like to be in a place where we can, find strategic reductions between the United States and Russia without inspiring China to build more arms. And I think, if you look at the sheer numbers right now, obviously Russia and the United States far outnumber China. We don't want to put them in a position where they feel like they have to catch up. But it's not just about arms control in the traditional sense of how many nuclear weapons do you have. There's a whole new generation of arms control that we have to talk about. What about biotech weapons? If there's one thing that COVID-19 has brought to the forefront, it is the importance of biotechnology as a national security issue, not just a healthcare issue. What about cyber? China attacks us every single day through the internet, and yet that's not a part of any arms control agreement. It probably should be in the future. So we don't want to just go back in time. There are mistakes that the Trump administration has made that I regret, and I would prefer that they had not handled some of these situations as they have. But irrespective, we have to modernize, and we have to recognize that we live in a world with threats that were not contemplated just a few decades ago.
I'm going to open up to the floor in just a minute. So please, those who would like to ask questions, please raise your hands, or please type your questions in. I'll put them to the panel. Before I do that, I'd just like to go back to Sir Michael for one moment, which is to think back on the nature of the threats we face, which has kind of been a thread throughout lots of these comments. And even before the pandemic, a subject that would come up again and again in defense discussions amongst think tanks, amongst experts in the scholarly community, was the idea of resilience against hybrid threats, non-traditional threats, sub-conventional threats. If we hadn't been in lockdown, I was due to be in Sweden about this time for total defense exercises, which is a national Swedish exercises to think about ways of coping with non-traditional threats. I'd just like to get you to say a bit more on whether and to what extent and how defense industry is able to respond to that strand of concern on non-traditional threats, or whether that's sort of something that's outside of your purview.
I mean, it's absolutely inside the purview of the industry as a whole. You use the word defense industry, it starts there, but it goes wider than that, because some of the new threats that you're talking about are maybe infrastructure threats, or cybersecurity is another one where the industry as a whole spends a heck of a lot of time, thought, and research. So the need to prepare our defenses in the widest sense, I don't just mean physical sense of defenses, but that sort of cyber infrastructure and so on type of defenses, is as high as it's ever been, and the range of that is broadening. So I go back to my point about how imperative it is that industries across the Atlantic work together, and that we don't dissipate our energies by doing things separately, because we need the best we can get, given that proliferating range as well as scale of new threat. I'm completely with you on that range.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to the floor for a moment and ask a question that's asked by Ginta Palubinskas, Professor of Political Science at West Virginia State University, And she asks, what's the single greatest threat from Russia that NATO member states face today? Although I appreciate it's probably difficult, if not impossible, to ask anyone to pick out a single threat, I think it is important that we're able to prioritize and that we're able to understand where should the weight of resources be. We can't fudge the issue by simply saying we have to do everything. We may have to do everything, but of course governments still have to prioritize. And so I'd like to go back to Minister Pabriks and ask you how your priorities are changing and what lies at the top of that list, and whether that's different to what it would have been 4 or 5 years ago.
No. Our priorities didn't change because our defense planning was adopted, basically, program was adopted for 12 years. One of the last changes we made after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, 2014. Of course, readjustments are happening every year. But if you ask me about the largest single threat, and of course this is a hypothetical question because there is never just a one question, there's always a complex. It's just like, you know, professionals in karate or boxing attacking, they'll not hit you just once. They'll hit you very quickly and many times, and probably hard. But I would say that one of the largest problems is really our own lack, as you mentioned, of resilience, of understanding of the real original threat, which is from outside. So I think that the largest threat is ourselves as a European community and as a NATO community, that we are making so many openings. Speaking in a boxing terms, we are putting our hands too frequently down and opening our face for others. So I think this is important. Precisely in our Latvian case, we are already for the second year working on so-called comprehensive defense system, which means that knowing the lack of our resources, we are trying to integrate military with business circles and with civil society, which is a pattern adopted by a number of countries in the world, like Switzerland, Singapore, Taiwan, partly Finland, and partly Sweden. And in our case, it seems that it was also one of 5 reasons why we had a better and smoother response also to the threat of COVID-19, because we have been capable to make timely decisions and our society was well organized, also as a surprise, in fact, to ourselves. Thank you.
I wanted to jump in, if I may, after the minister, because I wanted to pick up on the point he made about his kind of whole of government and whole of society approach. I think that that is actually all important nowadays in building up resilience and in being able to address the threats as they are emerging today. I think in the last 6 years, NATO has done an actually good job in responding to potential kinetic threats from Russia. There's still, of course, more work to be done. The threat of modern Russian missiles deployed in the heart of Europe in Kaliningrad. I think NATO still has work to do in that realm. But, you know, we put in place our deterrence tripwire, the 4 battle groups, including one in Latvia, a very important way to ensure the first layer of deterrence. And since that time, we have been working steadily, NATO has been working steadily on building up reinforcement capability. Now we have to turn, I think, to the realm of the non-kinetic threats, because warfare today is taking place in the hybrid space. And we've already heard this morning about China attacking daily, from the congressman, China attacking daily with its cyber capabilities, but Russia attacks daily as well. And so we are confronting threats of that kind in the hybrid space. It's what we think of as a gray area between peace and war, but in fact, it is a place where conflict is being contested every single day. And I think it is important that we think about building up our resilience in that area, building up our ways to respond in that area, and building up our ways to deter in that area. And these are really different concepts from what has existed in the past. And that, to my mind, is where we need to put the greatest attention today. NATO has created cyber as a realm of operations. It's also focused on the hybrid threats and how to address hybrid threats of all kinds, including the use of disinformation and propaganda. But But these are, some of them are old problems that have a new angle to them because of social media and the development of information technology. But in a lot of ways, we are confronting, I think, a daily struggle in the hybrid space that we need to be paying more attention to.
Thank you. First of all, can I just...
Shashank, can I just jump in there as Michael here, just in response to what the last two speakers have just said. I mean, that response to the new threats they're talking about has to be a partnership between government and industry, because we're talking technology, essentially. And these new technologies that are moving at an incredible pace are being developed in the private sector. I don't just mean defense private sector, I mean across the private sector. I just make that point for partnership, government and industry.
Thank you. And for those watching online, following on Twitter, can I please remind them to use the hashtag Brussels Forum, to send your questions in that way. Can I just go back to you, Rose Gottemoeller, to ask about a question that's come in from Madeline Moon, who asks, the Convention on Biological Weapons is due to be revised next year. How can we finally reach consensus and agreement on this convention? I think it's clear for the last several years, we've thought a lot about chemical weapons, their use in Syria, and in other contexts has put that at the forefront of our minds. And now that we face this sort of incredible biosecurity challenge, categorically not a bioweapon or a militarized biosecurity challenge, but a biosecurity challenge nonetheless, I think it's brought some attention back to bio threats of all kinds. So what are your thoughts on that? If I could just drop that back to you.
Very good question, and I thank my friend and colleague Madeline Moon for bringing it up today. The Congressman has already mentioned the fact that we are facing these biomedical threats these days, but the problem of biological warfare is an old one, and the Biological Convention has been in place now for some decades. The issue with the BWC, the Biological Weapons Convention, is that it does not have a verification regime associated with it, and so the notion of challenging through an inspection process a country to prove that it is not engaged in a BW program, that simply has not been possible. The question, of course, is it a good idea now to move forward with a verification regime for the BWC? I continue, frankly, to have questions about it because of the close intertwining between the legitimate biomedical community and industry, and also research and science, which we need to be focused on nowadays to do things like develop a vaccine for the pandemic, for the COVID-19 pandemic, and the potential for illicit, illegal use of bio means to attack, to disrupt. And so I think it's a very difficult problem. I frankly think we need to be looking at some new ways to tackle this problem. The biological industry and medical community have done a lot of work over the years with approaches like codes of conduct and ways of building up their laboratory systems to ensure against misuse. And I think we need to really talk with industry. We need to talk with the research community and figure out hard how to move forward now in building up our capability to ensure against misuse of biomedical facilities and bio means. Perhaps it's not the right thing to focus on trying to actually structure a verification regime for the BWC. These are, again, questions that deserve a lot more attention, a whole panel at the Brussels Forum, by the way, but that would be my initial response.
Congressman Moulton, can I go to you now and just ask you on a broader theme, your views on the US's posture in Europe? This is prompted by the question of the potential withdrawal of US troops from Germany, which has been which is not confirmed and may not happen, but would represent quite a significant shift. And what I'm interested in asking you is whether the American people can be convinced that the weight of US interests still favors that kind of heavy footprint, substantial presence in a country like Germany, or even in Europe, where we still see things like the European Deterrence Initiative running at many billions of dollars a year, when the equivalent funds for the Indo-Pacific region are minimal. Is there an imbalance in resources that would have to be corrected by any administration, any successor to this administration, and sort of how do you make the case for these sort of big heavy footprints at this time when people would raise their eyebrows and look at things like the increasing push for European sovereignty in defense, European sovereignty in technology, and may say, well, actually, this is not something the US ought to be underwriting in the same way?
It's an important question, and I will answer it. I want to just first go back to some things that Rose was saying, and just add a couple of just two important points on the bio warfare front. The first is I'm the co-chair of the Future Defense Task Force in the House Armed Services Committee, where we're really looking at where we need to be with our defenses, not 5 years from now, not 1 year from now, which is usually the focus of the American Defense Bill, since we have a defense bill every single year, but where we need to be 20 or 30 years from now. And we believe that one of the greatest potential threats in modern warfare
I think we may have lost you for a minute, Congressman.
Biotechnology to fabricate weapons. It's using biotechnology in ways that that haven't even been contemplated yet. And so when we talk about renewing these agreements, we again have to really modernize them for a totally new world, where biotech is the biotech revolution is the information technology revolution of the coming decades. And if you think back to the information technology revolution, the West won that revolution. We have had a commanding lead over our adversaries because we had the best microprocessors, the best computer technology. We lead the world right now, and with companies like Google and Facebook. We got to win the biotech race as well. And China is very much set on winning that race. And so, one, we have to modernize. Two, we have to win. Now, with regards to America's presence in Europe, as a Marine, I did not spend much time in Germany. Marines are one of the only services that's not on the ground in great numbers in Europe. But I was fortunate to spend a little bit of time going to some bases in Germany over the past year. And I've come to appreciate that there is much more value to our presence in Germany beyond simply, deterring the Soviet Union of old. And I think that what the American people need to understand is, first of all, it is expensive to bring troops back because you have to build new facilities back home that already exist in Europe. And there are additional costs in terms of what we lose in terms of pre-positioning our troops, not just to deter Russia, but to be closer to the Middle East, to be closer to hotspots around the globe, and fundamentally to understand the world a bit better because we have our troops living overseas and not just living in Kansas or Texas. So I think that there's a huge missed opportunity if we pull too many troops out of Europe. And I say that as even one of the people in Congress who is pushing most strongly for reform. Pushing for us to cut costs, pushing us to abandon the military of old so that we can make room in the budget for the military that we need for the future. Even with that perspective, I think there's a role for a continued presence in Europe, and I'm going to advocate for that in the Congress.
Can I also just push you a little bit more on the same subject, jumping off a question that's been asked by Ian Bond? Does the US want NATO countries to do more in the Asia-Pacific region alongside the United States, or does it want European NATO members to be able to defend Europe on their own, releasing the US to deal with China alongside US allies in Asia? In other words, is the pivot from Europe or with Europe, as Kurt Campbell used to say?
My strong view is my strong view is that it should be a pivot with Europe. That China poses a great threat to Europe, just as they pose a threat to the United States. And we have to do a better job of making that case to our European allies, that the role of NATO should be seen as, if we're a defensive organization, right, then we should be seen as defending ourselves as allies against all threats, and not just the threat that was squarely in our eyes when NATO was formed back in 1949.
I have a slightly different view of that, Shashank, if I may jump in. I always hesitate to disagree with a congressman, and so Congressman Moulton, I apologize, but
don't apologize, Rose. Don't apologize one bit.
I see the center of gravity for NATO is in its title. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So the center of gravity for NATO is squarely in the relationship between Europe and North America, and defending that space is that's in the Washington Treaty. That's the basis of NATO's foundation. Now, I do think, and it is important, that individual NATO countries cooperate with the United States in the Asia Pacific, and individual NATO countries are already doing that. UK, France, along with our Asian allies such as Australia, have been with the United States in the South China Sea with freedom of navigation operations and that type of thing. I think that's very, very important. But I do think NATO needs to keep its eye on its primary responsibilities, that is to defend in the Euro-Atlantic space.
I think it is worth pointing out that we have Japan has joined the Cyber Center of Excellence recently. I think Australia will be joining a NATO meeting for the first time outside the context of a specific mission like Resolute Support. And that, as I think Secretary General Stoltenberg said, NATO is not going to the South China Sea, but in some of these areas, particularly cybersecurity, you don't have to go to the South China Sea to weigh in on security challenges in this region. I'd like to go back to, Minister, I'd like to go back to you for this question, which has been asked by someone. COVID-19 caught the world and NATO off guard. Is NATO adequately prepared for future global issues, specifically climate change? And I think it's a valuable question, because climate change and some of the shocks that result from climate change have parallels to pandemics in that they are global, they're concurrent, they may be profoundly affect national resilience. And there are some specific military dimensions like melting Arctic sea ice that may accelerate militarization of the Northern Sea route and Arctic areas. And there are other issues like compounding stress and political fractures on Europe's periphery in ways that may drag Europe south and east. And I'd just like to get your sense on what are you as a defense minister doing to think ahead for those challenges, and how do you think they'll affect the work of your armed forces, your security establishment?
Well, we never can be 100% ready for any type of new challenges. There will be something always unknown. Even if we train, if persons train, if armies train, if societies or countries train, there will be always something unknown, but you will be needed to invent the response. But the thing is that this is why there exist exercises, and this is why there exist fundamental preparations against, I don't know why, but today I compare this always with individual preparedness for a human, but the same is also for organizations. As far as climate change, of course, there will be immediate practical necessities which we have to replan even in our country. For instance, we do expect more storms, we do expect more flooding, we do expect more forest fires, which means we, as a small country, will be in necessity to assist civil society and other forces with our helicopters, with our boats, with our ships, with other things, what we can use and what we will be needing to use. Plus, of course, there are such threats as a migration. Also, climate change can be used for the changes of strategic balance, including North and Arctic. And of course, it could happen also that climate change also can promote some kind of regional wars or regional conflicts because of the water scarcity or something else, which is not in our case. But yes, we do prepare with these things. This is not an immediate threat. These things are happening, let's say, slowly at this moment, but we are already taking this to account once we speak about procurement.
Thank you. Michael, could I go back to you, please, and move you away from your defense industry hat and put your former British diplomat hat on for a moment, and ask you about Britain's position in all of this. We've discussed a little bit of Germany. We've had a Latvian view. Where do you see British security policy headed in terms of striking its sort of perennial balancing act in all of this? at a time when European defense initiatives are sort of proceeding apace with PESCO and other things. But there's also a sort of question marks over how broader trade negotiations will affect our foreign policy. Where do you think British security policy is heading in that context? Because of course it still remains a very significant military player in all of these discussions.
A very good question, and I'll come back to that. Before, I could just go back to the discussion on Asia, and just to add a footnote to what other speakers were saying about NATO out of area. I mean, there's increasing cooperation in defense industrial area between, for example, Australia and the UK, or India and America. You're seeing quite a lot of global, basically, defense collaboration, which I think is part of the response to the issues you were talking about. So back on Britain, I mean, I don't speak for the British government, haven't done so for 10 years now, but I think our country is going through a very interesting transition. The Brexit issue looms very large as we try and negotiate the right deals by the end of this year. And back to my earlier points, I think it's vitally important that we keep trade and borders as open as possible. That's the only way that, you know, as a collective, we will respond to the challenges we've spoken. I think Britain has to work out how much it still sees itself as primarily a European, power's the wrong word, but a country, and how much it's got a global footprint. I mean, the world has changed a lot since Britain had a bigger global footprint. I think we're going through a very introspective period here. My hope is that, and you've seen it already in the way this current government commits to the NATO 2%, my hope is that they will carry on with a very strong defense capability, and I don't see signs of that weakening, but how it engages with the rest of the world is a very open and interesting question.
Could I go back to the audience? We have a question on Libya or Syria. What should be the role of NATO in Libya or Syria against Russia's aggressive policy? Of course, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the US very prominently highlight Russian activity in Libya. And I think this gets back to that point of which of these many competing priorities we address. It's a sort of southern flank issue. It's one that's diminished in salience. A number of individual member states have taken more prominent roles. Italy, of course, has France. And interestingly, this is an issue like many we increasingly see in the NATO context, in which member states are pitted on different sides of a conflict. And of course, Turkey has also been very, very prominent in supporting the Tripoli government. And I wonder, as we think about how we arbitrate some of those issues where member states are at each other's throats in some cases, and in Libya is not a bad example of that. How do we arbitrate those things? Rose Gottemoeller, do you want to step in there and offer your thoughts on how we do that? Because of course, that's what prompted President Macron's infamous brain dead comment, this question of sort of strategic dissonance in these sort of out of area theatres on Europe's edge.
Yes, I have a somewhat jaded view of these issues, although these are very, very serious matters, of course. But we have had interest particularly from our Mediterranean allies over the years, in more attention to the South, on more attention to the threat of violent extremism in the South. But at the same time, it was a kind of push me, pull you type of relationship with NATO, and that we were hearing these requests and these calls, but then saying, no, wait a minute, we have it covered. That was very much the case with France in the Western Sahel, for example. We had our NATO partner, Mauritania, who's a member of our Mediterranean Dialogue Partnership. They were interested in seeing more NATO training for peacekeeping in helping out in the Western Sahel. And we had an answer, no, we don't want to go there from France. That has changed now. And I very much actually welcome President Macron's initiative to push NATO to say you should actually be more engaged and involved in some of these territories. And I think we have some potential now with the cooperation ongoing, particularly with the African Union on peacekeeping training, with the United Nations, cooperation on peacekeeping training, to perhaps influence for the good some of these extraordinarily difficult conflicts throughout these regions. But I do want to put that little note of irony on the table that we did have a push me, pull you situation in the past, which I think now is being rectified.
Thank you. I think we're coming almost to the end of our session, so perhaps I will just put one more question to Congressman Moulton before we end, and this is: what does the US expect from a renewed New START treaty that representatives of the US and Russia will start negotiating at the end of June? What would be a good outcome for the United States? Congressman Moulton, do you want to conclude us with your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll offer a fairly strategic answer to that question, which is just to say that we obviously want to be in a stronger position than we were before. And by that means, I mean a stronger treaty. We want to be at a place where we can actually achieve further reductions. But also, as I have said earlier, and a point that I've perhaps beaten people over the head with, we have to modernize these treaties to meet the threat to the new world. There's no question that there's interest in including China in these discussions. Whether or not that's a realistic possibility remains to be seen. But we're at a point right now in America where we are facing a massively expensive recapitalization of our own nuclear arsenal. And to have the opportunity to actually achieve some significant reductions before we have to make that investment would be highly advantageous for us from a budgetary perspective, and obviously it would be advantageous for world peace.
Thank you very much. I think that's a sensible phrase for us to conclude. What I take away from that discussion is a sense that the new normal, security after the coronavirus, is not transformative. It's compounded many of the things that the trends that we were seeing. Concern around the security implications of China's rise, from issues from disinformation to technology. Questions around resilience and hybrid threats. We're still very much in an Article 5 world. Conventional threats are still very prominent and they haven't gone away. But I think the pandemic has reinforced that question of how states deal with non-traditional challenges. And I think it has put a huge premium or sort of posed a huge question to that reflection process that NATO began before the pandemic arrived, but I think makes it incredibly important now. And in effect, what all NATO members now have to do, what the alliance has to do, is find a way of juggling more of these challenges with what I think will inevitably be less money. And I think we're sort of fumbling our way towards a sense of prioritization, how we do that. I don't think we've got there yet, but no doubt we'll narrow it down over more excellent panels like these. So thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you all for your views, and thank you all for joining us, and have a very nice afternoon.